In 1979, we had 39 plenary or fiscal responsibility only applications. And yet we only found that out within the last year. And so that's when we crossed the goal line, we scored a touchdown, Congress failed to act. That's why we need a mandamus case. But let me give you a few numbers. In 1979, total debt subject to the debt ceiling limit was $827 billion. Now it's over $31 trillion. Interest rates are headed up. What's 1% of 31 trillion? $310 billion. The fastest growing expense in the federal budget is interest. And what do you get for interest? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And federal debt to GDP has gone up from 32% to 124% and rising because of known demographic trends and rising healthcare costs. And last thing, Ken mentioned an excellent point about all you need is 13. In 1979, a majority of the states had fiscal responsibility only amendments. And therefore, the majority of those states can control the scope of the convention. And they can rule anything that goes beyond that subject matter out of order. So we really have two protections, the scope of the convention as well as to defeat any wrong-headed amendment. These are some graphics that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. That'll be in the presentation if you want a copy. This is what's happened to our budget since 1962 to now. The drivers are known demographic trends and rising healthcare costs, namely Social Security and Medicare and other related programs. This is what's projected to happen into the future, a growing gap between revenues and expenses driven by so-called mandatory spending, primarily social insurance programs and other related matters. Most economists will agree that the two most important things that we have to focus on for fiscal responsibility and sustainability is debt to GDP and interest as a percentage of the budget. In the history of the United States, until World War II, we never had debt to GDP over 40%. We reached a peak in World War II for understandable reasons. We brought it down dramatically by 1980 to about 35%. Now we are about at record levels and headed up rapidly. Too much debt means slower economic growth, less opportunity, squeezes national defense, hurts us in a number of different ways. This is a totally unacceptable outcome. And by the way, OMB, Office Management Budget, the Treasury Department, the Congressional Budget Office, the Government Accountability Office, which I used to head, and the Federal Reserve have all said we are on an imprudent and unsustainable fiscal path. Congress has failed to act. You need to be the solution to force them to act. Social Security and Medicare, they're trust funds, quote unquote, trust the government funds that are only funded by government debt. And I used to be a trustee of Social Security money from 1990 to 1995. They're going to go bust. 2034 for Social Security and 2028 for Medicare. And when that happens, Congress will be forced to act because otherwise retirees will have a 22% plus across the board cut in their benefits, and there's a 10 to 15% gap in Medicare payments in 2028. But Congress typically doesn't do anything until we're at the precipice. That's irresponsible. We need to force Congress to do something sooner rather than later because the power of compounding is working against us. There's two ways to get a constitutional amendment. The old-fashioned way, 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, send it to the states for ratification. That is not feasible in the current environment. And then Article 5, where 2/3 of the states file an application, they meet, a majority of the states propose an amendment, and then it goes back for ratification at the state level. This requirement was met in '79, and it's time that it happened. There are two pieces of legislation in the House right now drawing attention to this. Senator Braun is going to introduce legislation in the next Congress, and additional legislation will be introduced in the House again in the new Congress to focus on these issues and hopefully get us some progress. Last thing, you're going to hear in the last panel today a little bit about some options for a fiscal responsibility amendment. In doing that, it's important you understand that Ultimately, the decision will be made by the states, if it's a convention, of what to propose, or the Congress if they decide to get their act together and do something in order to avoid a convention. There are several illustrative ways to deal with this problem. One way is to focus on debt to GDP. Not total debt, but how much debt do we have as a percentage of the economy, the so-called burden, if you will. And one way to do it is to establish a credit card limit with very limited exceptions to set a lower target for debt to GDP that would be achieved in a year certain in the future with targets, triggers, and enforcement mechanisms, and to have an enforcement mechanism that would get people's attention. And one that might get their attention is, if you violate this, keep in mind, this is a constitutional amendment. Members of Congress swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. If they knowingly violate this, they lose their right to run for re-election. They lose their job. Now, there are other ways to do it, but that is the atomic approach. So why debt to GDP? It represents an approach that most economists can agree on. It's used by other countries. It's an approach that has probably the best chance to get bipartisan and trans-ideological support. It's more flexible and less gameable than a balanced budget approach. It's pro-growth oriented because if you grow the denominator faster than the numerator, even if the numerator is going up, you're making progress. It allows elected officials to decide how to deal with it, how much through mandatory spending reductions and restructuring of our social insurance programs, how much through reprioritizing, reducing projected defense and other discretionary spending, and how much to achieve through comprehensive tax reform that will generate additional revenues as a percentage of GDP. And it can have automatic enforcement and accountability mechanisms. That's important. You're going to hear other illustrative approaches. Again, if it goes to a convention, the states will decide the proposal. If Congress decides to get its act together and do something, then they will decide, but ultimately, it'll go to the states. And this is critically important.